Joumana Kayrouz. You've seen her images on giant billboards across the metro. Joumana Kayrouz. You've seen her images on buses across the city. Now get to know Joumana Kayrouz.
The war broke out in my home country, Lebanon. I was 11 years old, and I saw a lot of bloodshed and inequality and poverty. You can't grow up in an environment like that and not be affected by it and not want to make a difference. I graduated from Yale University with a master's in ethics. I speak 4 languages. It has always been innate in me fighting for the underdog and trying to do whatever it is I can to make a difference in the world.
Let Joumana Kayrouz protect your rights. Call the law offices of Joumana Kayrouz at 1-866-YOUR-RIGHTS, extension 100, or visit yourrights.com.
برنامج يور رايتس مع المحامية جومانا كيروز المختصة في قضايا حوادث السيارات مع نخبة من المحامين في اختصاصات عدة منها الطلاق والهجرة والإفلاس يأتيكم الآن على الهواء مباشرة. طابت أوقاتكم بالخير مستمعينا في كل مكان، ونرحب بكم في هذه الحلقة الجديدة من برنامج يور رايت مع المحامية جومانا كيروز على الهواء مباشرة. نستقبل اتصالاتكم والأرقام هي 313-769-6666 ومن وينزر كندا 519-256-1023. أيضا بإمكانكم الحصول على استشارات مجانية في القضايا التي يتعامل معها مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز، وهي قضايا الإصابات الشخصية من ضمن حوادث السيارات، إصابات العمل، الأخطاء الطبية، وأيضا قضايا الهجرة والتجنس، وقضايا الإفلاس، قضايا الضمان الاجتماعي، وقوانين العائلة والكريمنال لو. رقم الهاتف في مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز 248-557-3645. تحياتنا لكم. جومانا، مساء الخير.
مساء الخير رامي، يعطيك العافية. كيفك اليوم؟
الله يعافيك، الحمد لله. نسأل عنك، إن شاء الله تمام.
كتر خير الله بهالنهار المشمس والجميل. مساء الخير للجميع. مساء الخير لضيفي لليوم المحامي جاي ياسو اللي انضم لنا الشهر الماضي واللي بينضم لنا اليوم نحكي عن قضايا الإصابات الشخصية وبالتحديد الأخطاء الطبية. وقت ما نقول أخطاء طبية يمكن تكون خطأ طبيب، ممكن تكون خطأ مستشفى، ممكن تكون خطأ فارماسي، ممكن تكون خطأ ممرض، ممكن تكون خطأ راديولوجي. هدول كلهم is under the umbrella أخطاء الطبية medical malpractice. Good afternoon, Attorney Jaya. So how are you today?
Great to talk to you again, Joumana. How are you?
I am good. I hope you are doing well, your family as well.
Thank you for asking. My family's doing really well. Same to you and your family. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
يبدو أنه فقدنا جومانا. راح نحاول نتصل بها مرة أخرى ونذكر بأرقام الهواتف في الاستوديو 313-769-6666 519-256-1023. جومانا، فقدناك للحظات.
Oh, I am so sorry. بفتكر رامي, I think I'm touching my earpod too much, and by touching it, because I'm concerned it's gonna fall off, it is disconnecting. I'm gonna be careful. I do apologize.
No problem.
We were telling the listeners that when we talk about medical malpractice, it can be the result of a mistake by a doctor, by a hospital, by a nurse, by a pharmacy, by a radiologist, and the list goes on. Anybody within the larger medical field, correct?
Correct. Michigan actually defines that these are individuals who actually have a medical license, so they're medical providers who carry medical licenses.
Okay, so a pharmacist does carry a medical license.
Correct. You may get to the lower level medical people, aides, people, nursing assistants in hospitals and nursing homes that are not licensed by the states. So, again, this is a discussion for another day, but if those are individuals who are committing malpractice and they don't hold a license, we don't have to sue them under the medical malpractice laws in Michigan. And again, because there's no license attached to those occupations.
Thank you for this clarification. Very specifically today, we want to talk about medical mistakes that can happen during the pregnancy of a woman or during labor or during delivery or even immediately after delivery in what's called neonatal, because at any one of those uh, periods, there can be medical errors that can result in severe, lifelong physical injuries, brain damage to the child, to the newborn. And the cost of raising a child who, God forbid, suffers at the hand of the negligence of a doctor or anybody like that is extremely, extremely burdensome. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to have to raise a child who has been uh, injured to the extent that they now require 24-hour care. It's one thing to do that as a parent. It's another thing to have the cost associated with that care also be a burden on the family. So these are things that families who have been the victim of birth trauma have to deal with throughout the course of their lives in raising that child.
And not only will the future medical treatment of raising a child who was born with either brain damage or severe physical injuries because of the birthing process or the time of labor and delivery, but also such children will have very specialized education. They will not be through the regular school system. They will receive specialized education that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in the life of the child.
That's absolutely correct. And your audience may be thinking a little bit more about what we're talking about here. I mean, again, these are kids that we probably see every day growing up when we were in school. They may have been in special education, or that may have been, in our neighborhoods, and we never thought twice about it because, back then growing up, the thought was that this was all congenital or was hereditary, that the child is just merely born with these things, right? Well, as science has advanced and as research has gone forward, we've come to learn more. And many a times, and you're going to hear this word a few times during our discussion, many a times these children will develop what's called cerebral palsy, a fancy medical term that basically means brain damage. And children generally are not born with cerebral palsy unless there was an acute event that occurred a lot of times either during the course of labor and delivery, and sometimes right after delivery in the neonatal area that you mentioned. So, so as doctors and science has advanced, they look at all the medical records of these new infants, and they find out that there is something going on here that is preventable. That if only certain how do I say, careful acts had been taken, that child would be healthy and would be a healthy child for the rest of his or her life.
So, to be clear, we are talking about preventable physical injuries, brain damage, and so forth. Meaning, we're saying that had the doctors, nurses, hospital done what they should have done or not done what they did, then that child will not have suffered the injury that this child is now struck with for the rest of her or his life, correct?
Correct.
So we're talking about preventable.
Correct. So, Joumana, let me give you a really kind of a common example that we see in our practice. Again, we do a lot of birth trauma work. And so what we see is a relatively normal prenatal care. The mother is going to every prenatal visit. She's being weighted and she's
just to clarify, meaning while mom is pregnant.
While mom is pregnant, there's a period of 8 or 9 months where she's now in the hands of the OBGYN in their office, and they're monitoring mom's pregnancy, right? And the records are absolutely clean. Mom, this is a healthy, viable pregnancy, okay? And then you have a damaged child that's delivered, right? A child that has brain injury. So that what we do, we kind of work backwards. We say, well, what happened? And when you look at the records, again, the records are the best pieces of evidence that we have. You look at the records of the labor and delivery, and then you look at the fetal monitor strips, which your audience may or may not know, but it's really if you will, it's a monitor that's put on the mom, sometimes outside, sometimes on the inside, and put on the baby that can detect the baby's heart rate and oxygenation level. Okay. And so what we find a lot of times when we review the strips is that the baby is having a very difficult time breathing, and the heart rate is depleting, and nobody's watching. This is as clear as day. These strips are like EKG strips that you see for adults when they're having their heart tested, and nobody's paying attention. Nobody's worried about this child not getting enough oxygen. And we can talk about later why the child is not getting oxygen, but the reality is that somebody has to do something and get that child out. And if it's not by regular vaginal delivery, then you've got to rush that mom into the OR and do a C-section to get that baby out. And time is critical.
So sometimes the medical mistake begins while mom is pregnant. And what you want to make sure is that the fetus is not distressed. The fetus is not getting deprived of oxygen to her or his brain, that the heart rate of the fetus is normal, because if any of that is missing, then that mom needs to be put on bed rest and maybe delivered immediately by cesarean section.
Yeah, if there's any indication that the baby is in distress, the standard of care would be to make sure that mom is hospitalized, or mom is on bed rest or something, to make sure that baby goes through its normal pregnancy. Sometimes you have to, if the baby has reached a certain age or term, sometimes you got to go in there and remove the baby early. At 32-week gestation, the baby's not acting normally. The prenatal care is abnormal, and all of a sudden you got to go in there and get the baby out. There are a lot of healthy babies that were born prematurely. Okay, You got to get in there and get them out. But unfortunately, what we see is by the time the baby comes out, again, the baby's depressed, they're discolored, they're black and blue, they're not breathing, their arms are basically just laying on their side. They can't lift the arms. Mm-hmm. Okay, so these are all indications that the baby's depressed. And then there's other indicators such as APGAR scores, which we can talk about later. But these are scores that they put on a baby to determine whether or not the baby's healthy or normal, or abnormal. And and again, doctors and medical experts will tell you that the reason why the babies are like this is because, again, there was a distressful moment of time during the labor and delivery. The baby was not getting enough oxygen to the brain, and now there's brain damage.
Okay, so we have established that medical mistakes can begin as early as while mom is pregnant. We're going to take a quick break, and then right after that, we're going to talk about what can happen, what can go wrong during labor and delivery that could have been prevented if only, the team was paying attention and was adequately staffed and competent enough. Let's take a quick break, and then we will continue with Attorney Jay Yasso. We are talking today about we're talking about medical malpractice, أخطاء طبية, and very specifically, we're talking about preventable birth trauma or birth injuries.
مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يبحث عن موظفين يتحدثون العربية والإنجليزية بطلاقة، ويفضل أن يكون للمتقدم خبرة في العمل المكتبي. هذه الوظيفة بدوام كامل من الاثنين وحتى الجمعة من الساعة 9 صباحا ولغاية 5 مساء. تقدم الوظيفة العديد من المزايا، ومنها التأمين الصحي وإجازات مدفوعة وغيرها، ويقرر الدفع اعتمادا على سنين الخبرة. فمن يرغب بشغل هذه الوظيفة الاتصال بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز على الرقم 248-557-3645. في ظل ادعاءات التحرش الجنسي الموجهة ضد جامعة يونيفرسيتي اوف ميشيغان والدكتور روبرت أندرسون، يمثل مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز العديد من ضحايا هذه التحرشات. مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز حصل على تعويضات كبيرة في قضايا مماثلة تراوحت قيمتها ما بين 900 ألف إلى 3.3 مليون دولار. إذ كنت تعتقدين أنك من ضحايا التحرش الجنسي في جامعة يونيفرسيتي اوف ميشيغان أو من قبل الدكتور روبرت أندرسون، اتصل الآن بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز 1866 Your Rights 248-557-3645 والاستشارة مجانية. Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز.
ومنرجع مع المحامي ياسو اللي هو ضيفنا مرة تقريبا بالمعدل بالشهر، ومنتكلم عن الإصابات الشخصية وبالتحديد الأخطاء الطبية. اليوم عم نحكي بالتحديد عن الأخطاء الطبية اللي ممكن تصير، ومنحكي عن خطأ يعني كان فينا نتحاشى. by definition الخطأ يعني شيء غير مقصود بس كان فينا نتحاشى. الأخطاء الطبية اللي عم نحكي عنها اليوم هي الأخطاء الطبية اللي كان فينا نتحاشاها، اللي ممكن تسبب ولادة لطفل لجنين ويطلع عنده physical damage, physical injuries، أو يطلع عنده brain damage مثل مثلا cerebral palsy إلى آخره. حكينا أنه أوقات الأخطاء الطبية بتبلش هي والإمرأة حامل. تاني نقطة ممكن تكون وأغلب الأوقات بتصير عند وقت الولادة، بيسموها بالإنجليزي labor and delivery، يعني قبل ما السيدة تولد بتمرق بساعات وأوقات حتى أيام عم بتعاني من الألم ليتحضر جسدها لحتى تولد الطفل. هيدي الفترة فترة كتير critical، كتير حساسة، لأنه لازم الجنين يكون مراقب بطريقة دقيقة بطريقة متواصلة، لأنه معرض الجنين بأي وقت من هيدا الوقت أنه ينحرم من الأكسجين للدماغ تبعه، وهيدي بتكون مصيبة. فلح نسأل ولح نتكلم مع المحامي ياسو عن هيدا الموضوع. وأي شخص بحب يتصل أو يبعث لنا سؤال على الراديو، الأرقام بفتكر صارت معروفة من قبل كل المستمعين. نسأل المحامي ياسو.
نعم.
let's talk about.
عفوا جومانا، اسكوز مي جومانا، انه في عندنا سؤال على الواتساب، اذا حبيت لانه بالعربي راح اعطيه بشكل مختصر، سؤال شوي طويل. ما اعرف اذا في مجال انه يسأل المتصل اذا هل هناك فرصة لتقديم قضية. يعني زوجته هم ساكنين في مجمع للشقق السكنية، وزوجته فتحت الثلاجة وكان الضوء أو شيء معين بالثلاجة يمكن مكسور، فتسبب بجروح وتسبب أيضا مشاكل عادة، يعني بعد ما تقدر أنه تمسك الأشياء بأصابعها من هذا القبيل. فهل هناك فرصة أو يعني ظروف هذه الحادثة تأهل أنه يرفع قضية مثلا على أصحاب هذا المجمع السكني؟
بتصور نعم. بدك مثل كل negligence claim بدك تثبت إهمال، وبدك تثبت أنه صاحب الملك. هيدي النقطة المهمة هون الأساسية للسيدة اللي اتصلت، سلامة قلبها على فكرة. بدك تفرجي أنه كان عندهم علم وخبر بالماضي أنه في مشكل بالثلاجة. إذا كانت الثلاجة ما كان فيها مشكل قبل وما كان في ملاحظة، أو عندهم علم وخبر أنه في شيء عطل بقلب الثلاجة وصارت لأول مرة، ما في كون تحمل مسؤولية إهمال لصاحب المجمع. بس إذا كان عندهم علم وخبر بالماضي، وكان عندهم علم وخبر كافي، يعني مش قبل بربع ساعة بس قبل بوقت أنه كان والمفروض عليهم أنه يبعثوا حدا ليجي يصلح لهم هذا المكان، ساعتها ممكن تحملهم المسؤولية، لكن ساعتها بيكون في إهمال. وإذا في إنشورنس ساعتها في إنشورنس بتغطي، وهي it will be a negligence claim. يعني بدك تثبت إهمال. لتثبت إهمال إن كنت أنت بمجمع، ولا لتثبت إهمال إن كان أنت مثلا بكروجر أو ميسيز وقعد بالأرض، بدك تفرجي إذا شيء سببك توقع أو إذا زحطت على شيء، بدك تفرجي إنه there was notice، بدك تفرجي إنه كان عندهم علم وخبر بهذا الموضوع، كان عندهم وقت كفاية ليصلحوا الأمر بس ما صلحوا الأمر.
نعم. وعلى فكرة موجود المتصل أو سائل هذا السؤال على الهاتف، إذا نأخذه على الهواء جمانة. نعم.
رامي، لأنه خارج عن
نعم
موضوع اليوم، يمكن احتراما للمحامي
أكيد.
جياسو ما بناخد السؤال على الهواء، وإذا
نعم
فينا بكرة إذا بده، أو
إن شاء الله. أعتقد هو جاوبتي
نهار.
يعني تقريبا على معظم الجواب، بس إذا كان عنده أسئلة ممكن يتصل في حلقة أخرى إن شاء الله، نطلب من عندك تتصل بينا إن شاء الله. شكرا جزيلا.
وبيقدر كمان يتصل على المكتب رامي،
نعم
لأنه كل استشاراتنا مجانية، وبنحوله للمحامي الصح اللي بيكون المحامي هاورد رادنر.
م-م.
خلاصة الأمر أستاذ، بدك تثبت إهمال من قبل المجمع، ولا تقدر تثبت إهمال بده يكون كان عندهم علم وخبر إنه هيدا الثلاجة فيها مشكلة من قبل،
نعم
بس هن ما صلحوا الأمر.
م-م.
نعم. وبنرجع مع المحامي جياسو وبننتقل للإهمال اللي ممكن يصير during labor and delivery. على فكرة، من أكثر الدكاترة اللي بيشتروا إنشورنس غالية كتير 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 لأنه عليهم خطر أنه يقام دعوة ضدهم، هن دكاترة من فئتين: neurosurgeons لأنه بيشتغلوا بالدماغ، والobstetricians لأنه بيخلفوا الأطفال. Attorney Jayaso, the doctors who pay the most in malpractice insurance are neurosurgeons and obstetricians, correct?
I have not seen the studies lately, Joumana, but I think you're probably accurate, because, in my opinion, those are probably the two highest risk areas of medical practice. It would probably be neurosurgeons and OBGYNs.
Yes, and whereas I have not seen any recent literature, the last time I looked at that, not too long ago, that was the case, because neurosurgeons work with the brain. God forbid if something goes with the brain. And obstetricians give birth to children.
Yep.
Let's talk about to infants. Let's talk about what can go wrong during labor and delivery. And again, whereas the delivery might be very quick, the labor might go on for hours and days. Hours and days.
Well, remember, the doctors are trained to look at all parts of the delivery itself. So not just mom's condition, but they also have to be able to assess the baby's condition while the baby's inside of mom. That is, the baby's height and size and weight, because, if the baby's too big for delivery, that may be a cause for turning the vaginal delivery into a C-section because the baby is too big to be delivered. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to learn about it. But doctors a lot of times really don't know, to be honest, what causes a baby to not be able to receive oxygen during the course of the delivery. If you talk to defense lawyers, the ones who represents the doctors and the hospitals, they'll tell you that this is like just one of those something that happens inside that we just don't know. It's the propulsion test where the baby comes down too hard sometimes causes an injury. There's all kinds of theories that the defense bar will raise. But our experts, top-notch experts around the country working at the major medical centers, will tell you that we really don't know what causes it, but we do know how to monitor on them to prevent them.
Exactly.
That's what we need to do.
So the focus,
please.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, that's why you have the staff around you. So if the OBGYN is not available, the obstetrical nurses and the aides are available that can read and interpret all of the diagnostic tests that are put on mom during the course of delivery. And they're the ones that can call the doctors if something goes wrong,
Okay, so what you are saying is, it seems we don't know when and why and how an infant, a fetus, will suffer oxygen deprivation. But here is what we know. If we are carefully monitoring the infant through the fetal strips that are attached to the mother's belly, then we can immediately do something about it before it becomes a lifetime medical injury. Right. So it's a lot like we don't know why the cancer is in the body, but if we're paying attention, depending on when you go to the doctor, You can catch it early, nip it in the bud, and it's a thing of the past. And I know it's a weak analogy, but it's a little bit, doesn't matter why you get cancer. Sometimes a lot of these cancer cases are not that the doctor created the cancer, but that the doctor did not timely diagnose the cancer, and the untimely diagnosis caused the person to die.
Correct. And Joumana, so far we've only been talking about oxygen deprivation while the baby's inside of mom that can result in a brain injury. There are other ways that the babies will also suffer a brain injury. For instance, I talked earlier about the baby being large baby. They call those macrosomic pregnancies, where the baby's head is large. And so the doctors are in there, for instance, using certain tools like forceps or vacuums to extract the baby. And without a really trained obstetrician, putting the forceps on the brain, on a very soft newborn's head, can really cause a lot of injury. And we find that there is brain damage from using forceps or vacuums in delivering children.
And that is a preventable injury?
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. They have to be able to deliver the child without injury. Okay. There's another incident where, and this is not a brain injury, but it's really a shoulder brachial plexus. Shoulder dystocia is what it's called. After the baby's head is delivered, the next largest part of the baby's body are the shoulders. The shoulders get stuck, and one of the shoulder, the anterior shoulder, is stuck under the mom's pubic bone, the top layer bone. And the doctors are trained not to pull at the baby's head. They're not supposed to pull to get the baby out. There's all kinds of maneuvers that they can use that can dislodge that shoulder, without injury. Well, doctors are using bad maneuvers, and by the time the baby's delivered, that baby has a permanent nerve damage to the arm and shoulder, where the baby is unable to use the arm for the rest of his or her life.
Correct. Now, the shoulder dystocia is, again, a preventable injury that happens during delivery, not specifically labor, but delivery.
Correct.
And it has to do with the technique of the doctor. And it does not result in any brain injury. It is a physical injury. So if you looked at someone, you'd see that they don't have very good use of one side of their body, and that corresponding shoulder is a little bit stooped down or dropped.
You call it a physical injury. It's a physical and a neurological injury, because you're affecting a bundle branch of nerves at that shoulder area that's been injured. And the University of Michigan Medical Center has a wonderful shoulder dystocia clinic that a lot of babies get sent to after they're delivered with these types of injuries. And they're in there doing unbelievable surgeries with nerve and tendon transfers to try to get that arm to move again. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But you're right. When you look at the child from the outside, the baby is perfectly fine, except for the fact that they can't move one arm.
So they've gone a very long way. I once knew somebody who's about 65 years old, back in Lebanon, who did have shoulder dystocia. Now you're telling me, and we're saying they are preventable. So to deliver a baby with shoulder dystocia would be a medical malpractice, would be a medical error. And you are now telling me that at least at the University of Michigan Shoulder Dystocia Clinic, they try to operate on an infant young enough to see if they can redevelop the nerves in that area and rehabilitate that injury from a lifetime injury to maybe something that they can heal from. Sometimes it works and sometimes it's not successful.
Correct. They can sometimes get some of the function of their arm to move and so forth, but they a lot of times can't get it to 100%, because what you find a lot of times is the nerves from that bony area in the shoulder have actually been ripped away by the pulling of the head and trying to deliver the child. And it's really, really, I mean, we talk about very small nerves for a newborn. And again, they've done remarkable work at the U of M, but again, some of these children are still left with major residual damage to that arm.
So far, Attorney Jaya, so we're talking about what can go wrong that is preventable. That's the key, preventable during labor and delivery. We talked about what you call a macrosomic pregnancy, where the head is very large, the infant is too large, and maybe should not be delivered vaginally. We talked about, and something can go wrong if the infant is delivered vaginally. We talked about when the infant is deprived of oxygen, and although we don't know when and who and why, we know that if you are closely watching as a nurse the fetal strips of mom, you can immediately see the onset of that, and immediately in under 2 minutes have that child delivered via C-section. And the third way something can go wrong that we can prevent during delivery is what we call shoulder dystocia. And one of the shoulders is delivered with an injury. Are there other ways where errors can happen, preventable errors, during labor and delivery?
So the answer is yes, and there's a lot of different ways that, I mean, for instance, there's medication errors, during the course of delivery. For instance, Pitocin is given, and that helps mom's uterus contract so that the pregnancy can move forward. And sometimes they may give inappropriate amount of medication, which can affect the unborn child. So there could be medication errors that could result in fetal issues. Really, more often than not, it's really trying to get the baby out when there's fetal distress. Again, trying to monitor the baby. The mom comes in with labor and labor pains. Her water is broken. She's sitting there for hours, and somebody has to watch that baby. Sooner or later, if the baby's heart rate goes down and you don't do anything, then you're going to deliver a very depressed child. So that's what we find most of the cases is that, it's during the course of those last few hours before delivery that the child really should have been delivered sooner, but it wasn't because, again, nobody's around. The nursing staff is not paying attention. And a lot of times the OBGYNs are not even in the hospital.
Right. And when you say delivered sooner, you mean via a C-section?
Correct. Or again, I believe that there's techniques that they can use that can even expedite a vaginal delivery. If that child needs to come out, but if you find, as soon as you find that the baby's heart rate is going down and you can't deliver that child vaginally, then you have no other choice as an obstetrician but to get that child into the OR and deliver via C-section.
Attorney Jaya, so the use of Pitocin and other medication errors, how much does it account for the number of negligent labor and delivery behavior? Is it a small percentage?
I can't say it's a small percentage because a lot of times what we find is that the amount of medication either was written wrong or somebody didn't know how to administer it and they've given too much. And what you find is a lot of times the patients can overcome the medication errors. I mean, the human body can withstand it and they overcome it, so they're perfectly fine. But in other cases, these medication errors can, in fact, lead to long-term, long effects, devastating consequences. Are they small? I wouldn't say they were small. I probably would think that out of all the birth trauma cases, maybe 15 to 20% of them could be related to medication errors.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought this the percentage would be this high. And of all the errors during labor and delivery, what's the percentage that you would attribute to misusing the forceps or the vacuum suctioning, resulting in shoulder dystocia and so forth?
It's a smaller amount. I would say it's hard for me. I've not seen the statistics on this, but I would say, at least from our office's experience, it's probably in the range of about 5% of all the cases.
Yeah, I would have thought that as well. Yeah. Okay, so it's really, 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 truly preventable. So it's fair to say that the greatest majority of what goes wrong during labor and delivery is oxygen deprivation and failing to respond to that in a timely manner.
Yeah. Yep. The way I think about it is a lot of
Or any
parents.
fetal distress. Yes. Sorry.
No. A lot of parents really don't know when their baby is born. They're so elated, they're happy. But as time moves on, if doctors are telling them that there's something wrong, and tests are run and something's not right, they shouldn't just assume that it was God given or was their fault. Okay, there's reasons why a child is losing oxygen while they're inside of mom and nobody's paying attention. Somebody has to be watching that child closely. But I mean, more often than not, what we find is that even though there might be some errors out there, the child, ABGAR scores that are low initially are now better at 5 minutes when they were bad at 1 minute. The child does improve over time, and so in those situations, there's no cases, obviously. But where you find that there's again these long-term effects from devastating oxygen deprivation, then I think the doctors have to sit up and listen. Otherwise, these mistakes are going to continue to occur over and over again.
So what you are saying is that often mom and dad would not notice anything peculiar about the child, and it's as the child is growing, they're not reaching the milestones they should be reaching for a child of their age, and that's when you start suspecting that maybe something went wrong during labor and delivery. You start looking at every possible cause, beginning from the pregnancy on to the delivery, onto the neonatal care and so forth, correct?
Correct. You absolutely do. So again, now you have a healthy child that's been delivered. We haven't talked about this, and now you're in the neonatal area. And I'm just going to use an example. Let's just say some medication was given to that child that was contraindicated, and the child now went into a seizure and has brain damage. It didn't happen during the course of labor and delivery. It happened in the neonatal area. So these things can occur. We've had a baby that's been dropped in the neonatal, has had brain damage. We've had other reasons why you might have injuries in the neonatal areas. But, and then, yes, and parents are not going to know a lot of times unless the doctors tell them. Milestones are critically important, Joumana. When you see a child that's supposed to crawl, for instance, at 6 months, not crawling until they're at 12 months. A child that's supposed to be standing at 12 months is not standing until 15 months. There's some delays there, and doctors, pediatricians have to explain what that's being caused by. Tests have to be done. For instance, if there's brain-related situations, MRI of the brain has to be done to get a better picture and a diagnosis of why this child is lagging behind other children his age or her age.
Okay. And since you mentioned APGAR scores a couple of times, can we share with the listeners what an APGAR score is? If I remember, it is performed at 1 minute after you give birth. Then it's repeated at 5 minutes. And if I remember, and maybe 10 minutes again, but I'm not sure. And if I remember, there were 5 factors, color, stuff like that they look at to assess the health of the infant at the moment of birth.
Correct. So, and your memory is very good. And every hospital does it a little bit differently. But what the hospitals will do in the delivery is they will put a score on the baby at the age of 1 minute, or sometimes they do it at 3 minutes. Then they'll do it at 5 minutes, and they might do it at 10 minutes. And it's a score from 0 to 10. And it does look at babies' breathing, their skin tone, their movements, arm movements, their crying. And, the closer you get to that 9 or 10, the healthier the baby or the normal the baby is. If you get scores in the 1, 2, 3, 4 range, then there's some problems with the baby and you need to find out what it is. Like I said before, you may get really bad scores right after the baby is born, but at 5 or 10 minutes, all of a sudden these numbers are improving. The color is coming back and the baby's breathing better, etc. And those are important, again, landmarks that we look at and then doctors look at to determine whether or not you have a baby that's depleted, that's depressed, or a normal baby.
I'm sitting listening to you, and I used to do this area of the law when I started practicing as a lawyer over 20 years ago. And now I'm thinking, women used to do this at home, and they had their moms, or in every village there would be a woman who knew, I don't remember what the word is in English, but who would help women give birth. And here you're
like a midwife?
Like a midwife. But again, back then, they had no nursing experience. They had no professional training whatsoever. They just had experience.
Right.
And to think that we used to do it this way, and now with all the technology, and yet medical errors happen, it's just mind-boggling.
Right. You know, in the old country, and as you know, I'm Middle Eastern also. If you asked a Middle Eastern woman like my mother, you know, how many children do you have? She'll say, I had 8 children, but I was pregnant 11 times. And you'll ask the question, well, what happened to the other 3 pregnancies? And they said, we really don't know. They were just bad pregnancies. You know, back then, they really did not know why they were losing children, you know. And like you said, here with advanced science and medicine, we have a better idea what's causing these problems, and we try to do our best to try to prevent them.
And there is a lot we don't know today that advanced medicine and science will shed light on even 5 years from now. 50 years from now, it will be a completely different world as well. We keep learning more and more every day.
Correct.
Let's take a very quick break, and we will continue with Attorney Jay Yasso. And so far, we've been talking about birth trauma or birth injuries. We're going to discuss right after the ad why these cases, very sadly, I know it brings you no joy, but at the same time, people come to you after the alleged negligence happened. First of all, how do we know? What if somebody's suspecting? How do they know? And 2, why is it that these cases can bring tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to the family?
مكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز يبحث عن موظفين يتحدثون العربية والإنجليزية بطلاقة، ويفضل أن يكون للمتقدم خبرة في العمل المكتبي. هذه الوظيفة بدوام كامل من الاثنين وحتى الجمعة من الساعة 9 صباحا ولغاية 5 مساء. تقدم الوظيفة العديد من المزايا ومنها التأمين الصحي وإجازات مدفوعة وغيرها، ويقرر الدفع اعتمادا على سنين الخبرة. فمن يرغب بشغل هذه الوظيفة الاتصال بمكتب المحامية جومانا كيروز على الرقم 248-557-3645. هل أنت بحاجة للمساعدة في جلب شريك الحياة إلى الولايات المتحدة؟ بالرغم من أن إجراءات الهجرة على أساس الزواج معقدة للغاية، إلا أن محامي الهجرة من مكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز تمكنوا بنجاح كبير مساعدة آلاف الأشخاص للهجرة إلى أمريكا، لأن لديهم الخبرة الطويلة في مساعدة الأشخاص على الحصول على الجرين كارد على أساس الزواج أو فيز الخطوبة بشكل سريع ومريح بقدر المستطاع. اتصل الآن بمكاتب المحامية جومانا كيروز 1866 Your Rights 248-557-3645. Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. عودة إلى برنامج Your Rights مع المحامية جومانا كيروز. أرقام الهواتف في الاستوديو 313-769-6666 519-256-1023. جومانا نرجع لك.
شكرا رامي، شكرا، ثانك يو فيري ماتش. واللي بيحب يتصل او يعلق على الموضوع يا اهلا وسهلا فيهم. حكينا عن الطرق العديده اللي ممكن يصير في اهمال عند الولاده او عند الليبر، بيسموه بالانجليزي، يعني الساعات وحتى اوقات الايام اللي هي بتكون قبل لحظه الولاده. وعم نحكي عنهم لانه مثل ما قلنا النقطه الاساسيه هون انه فينا نتحاشاهم، هن preventable injuries. بالاخطاء الطبيه بنحكي عن اخطاء ممكن نتحاشاها. الاخطاء اللي بتصير اللي ما بنقدر نتحاشاها بنقول هيدي اخطاء بتجي من عند الله، وبالتالي ما بحق له صاحب الشأن انه يقيم دعوة ضد المستشفى او ضد الطبيب بسببها. لا يقدر انسان يقدم دعوة او يكون عنده cause of action ضد طبيب او اي شخص بالمجال الطبي، بده يثبت اول شيء انه الاصابة was preventable، الاصابة كان ممكن يتحاشاها. كيف بيتحاشاها الطبيب؟ الطب بيقول 1 2 3، وقت اللي الطبيب بيعمل 4 5 6 يعني الطبيب ما تبع الطب. لو الطبيب تبع الطب ما كانت صارت هيدي الإصابة. مشان هيك بنقول إنه ما بنعرف مثلا ليش الطفل أوقات أو الجنين بالأحرى بيصير عنده فيتال ديستريس أو بيصير عنده مشاكل أكسجين لدماغه، بس بنعرف إنه إذا كنا عم نطلع على الفيتال ستريب مونيتور والفيتال ستريبس الدي سيلز الأكس سيلز الليت دي سيلز إلى آخره، بنقدر نعرف هدول الدلائل بتقلنا إذا هذا الجنين عم ببلش يتعرض لأكسجين deprivation أو عنده أي نوع من الدسترس. ساعتها الطب بيقول إنه لازم يتصرف الطبيب بطريقة سريعة ويخلفوا الولد بطريقة سريعة. بأقل من دقيقتين ممكن الدكتور يكون أخذ القرار إنه يخلف الجنين via C-section ويطلع الجنين من بطن أمه. So الأكسجين deprivation مش الدكتور اللي بيفتعلها، بس وقت اللي بيتأخر failure to respond timely من قبل الدكتور هي ال preventable، هي الخطأ الطبي اللي could have been preventable. So حكينا عن الأكسجين deprivation، حكينا عن الطفل اللي بيكون كبير بيسموها ماكروسوميك pregnancy، حكينا عن أوقات استعمال الفورسبس والفاكيوم بطريقة غلط، حكينا أوقات عن استعمال الدواء. في كتير نساء إذا مش أغلبية النساء هن وعم بيولدوا قد ما بيكونوا عم بيتألموا الألم بيكون كتير 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 كبير، بيعطوهم شيء بيسموه بيتوسن لحتى يعجلوا لهم بالطلاق لحتى يقدروا يولدوا بطريقة سريعة. إذا استعمال البيتوسن كان غلط، استغربت أنا اليوم المحامي جياس وقال إنه تقريبا 15 ل 20% من الأخطاء الطبية اللي بتصير عند الولادة هي بتجي من استعمال البيتوسن بالكمية الغير صح. بدنا نحكي هلأ شوي عن ليش للأسف، بنقول للأسف لأنه بنتمنى لو هدول الأخطاء ما بتصير، بس ليش للأسف وقت بيكون في أخطاء طبية during labor and delivery، التسويات إن كانت settlement أو الفيردكت. بتذكر من تقريبا 9 أشهر أول مرة استقبلت المحامي جياسو على الهواء، حكينا عن أعلى فيردكت هون في ولاية ميشيغان من قبل مكتب محاماة تعدى إذا ماني غلطانة 150-170 مليون دولار. وهذا كله رح نحكي ليش، وليش المحامي جياسو وقت اللي بيعمل تسويات أو فيردكت بهدول الأمور بيجيب عشرات ملايين الدولارات. Attorney Jayaso, can you tell the listeners why sadly, we say sadly because I know you wish you never get any one of these cases. We wish we never hear about these preventable injuries during labor and delivery. But why is it that when you have these cases, you settle these cases for tens of millions of dollars? If you remember about 9 months ago, our first show ever together, I was sharing with our listeners and with each other the highest verdict to date in a labor and delivery case. And if I remember, it was maybe 135 million now that I think about it, something like that. Can you tell the listeners why sadly these cases can result in a very, very high recovery to the family?
Sure. As you can see, these are primarily brain injury cases. And so the infants, which will one day grow into young adults and then into adults, will need to be cared for. They're unable most of the time to care for themselves. Some of them are wheelchair bound. Some of them are on their back for the rest of their life. Some of them are more functional, but they're still in special education. Whatever level they're at based upon their injury, somehow there has to be some medical care that's associated with that for that child's life. Okay, so in the future, if the child needs surgery, if the child needs shunts because he has a brain injury or they need medication, all of that gets tabulated by lawyers when they're asking the other side to compensate the family. So the reason why the verdicts or the settlements are so large in these birth trauma cases is because the cost of future medical care is so high. Again, you're talking about newborns, and if they live until their normal life expectancy, let's say of a white male would be 80 years old, then you're compensating that child for 80 years. And the numbers can be high based on that.
So you do something before you settle a case, or if you are in front of a jury, something called like a medical care plan, where you project, you tell the jury, or if you're sitting trying to settle the case with the lawyers for the doctors or the hospital, you will be able to show how much that child is going to cost the family and the system in year 1 of its life, year 2 of its life, year 10 of its life, year 20 of its life, year 30, year 40, year 60, year 80. And then you put that at present day value in order for you to come up with a number, so it adds up. When you add the medical care that this child will need for the first year of its life, plus whatever attendant care, nursing care, specialized education, which maybe is not needed until the first 4 or 5 years of its life. When you start adding that, and then you add year 1 plus year 2 plus year 3 plus year 4, it's going to become in the tens of millions of dollars, correct?
Correct. So you're absolutely right. Again, we as the patient's lawyers have to carry the burden when we're in court. We have to bring forth evidence to put all of these numbers together. And so part of that involves hiring a life care planner. Sometimes these are nurses or doctors in the business of basically assessing a patient's current condition and future medical needs. And they put together, as you mentioned, a very lengthy life care plan that sets forth, all of the needs for the future, whether it be medical care, medical costs, home modification, attendant care, medication, all that gets wrapped into it. And that's, again, what gives you the big numbers.
Right.
And I'm sorry, one other thing. The life care planner is also teamed up with an economist, another expert that we have to hire. And it's that economist, you're right, will take those numbers from the life care plan and add interest to them, reduce them to present value to come up with a number that, the judge or the jury can see.
So really, a life care planner and then an economist are really doing math. They're adding up, all the medical costs, the education, the medication, the surgeries, whatever needed for every year. And then the economist adds all that up, adds interest in it, and brings it to present day value, because you're settling your case today for the next 80 years of the child's life, or you are trying your case today. And let's add one more thing in the last 4 minutes, 2 things, but let's add one thing. Mm-hmm. We hear about a lot of verdicts in court that can be in the 50 millions and 100 millions and whatever. And next thing you know, they get reduced because the jury never really knows what the insurance policy on the other side is, nor should they know. But in these cases, you can never, pain and suffering will be reduced to whatever the statute says. But what can never be reduced, and that is why you settle these cases in the tens of millions of dollars, is actual future medical and education costs. Because that's math, that's numbers, that's not pain and suffering. When you're adding $1 million for the first year and $3 million in medical treatment for the second year, and $4 million in the fifth year of medical treatment and specialized education and attendant care and home modification, whatever, there is no pain and suffering in that. So no one can take that amount and reduce it. Am I right?
You are correct. Again, there's so many obstacles into trying to get a settlement or a verdict. You got to look at the other side's insurance policies, whether they have a $20-30 million policy. You have to look at the caps, the Michigan statutory caps for pain and suffering, and all of that gets kind of blended in together. But, there's a thing that the judges can do later on. If, in fact, they think that the jury ran away with the verdict, they gave you $300 million, the judge can reduce on a motion, that verdict, that amount in the future, based upon whatever evidence gets presented, thinking that maybe it's excessive or it's beyond what the defendants can ever pay or whatever, something to that effect. So there are certain reasons, but you're right. When you get these larger verdicts, more often than not, the economic losses, the future medical costs, are usually not the areas that the other side will contest.
Okay. And in the 2 minutes remaining, Ram is telling us we have 2 minutes. How would somebody start if somebody sadly suspects that their child was the victim of medical malpractice during pregnancy, labor, delivery, or even post-delivery? Where do they start and how much time do they have? And we have about a minute and a half remaining.
You pick up the phone and you call Joumana Kayrouz. I mean, that's what you do, because honestly, as lay people, we really don't know what causes certain injuries or certain conditions. And as lawyers, we're trained to try to get answers, and we hire experts and we hire doctors. So if you don't know why your child is like this, or you have reason to doubt something happened or did happen during the course of delivery, pick up the phone and call the lawyer. The lawyers can get some answers for you.
So the medical records. Is there a time limit in less than 15 seconds? Is there a time limit?
For a child, you have until the child's 10th birthday, 10 years. Medical malpractice for an adult generally is 2 years.
Okay, so for a child, 10 years. However, we don't advise because memories fade, people die, people relocate. As soon as you suspect something, you need to call a lawyer. Attorney Jayaso, thank you so very much for this amazing, wonderful, valuable information. God bless you, and we will talk to you next month.
Thank you so much,
thank you very
Joumana.
much.